I want to continue to talk a little bit about prayer as we walk through Lent. And one of the great questions about prayer is, if prayer is a conversation and not a monologue, me talking to God, how is it that I listen? How do I hear from God? And obviously there are many ways in which we might say that we hear from God. Of course, the primary way that we hear from God is through reading the Scriptures. And so part of our prayer life and certainly our discipleship life needs to be being in the Scriptures and reading the Scriptures, reading them for understanding, reading them slowly and carefully. And that's, of course, the first and primary place that we hear from God. It is God's Word written, and it is that which helps us understand what God actually wants to say to us. But I think there's another part about listening and hearing from God in ways that are that enrich our own life and our own experience of God. And I want to just let's talk about how we hear from God, and perhaps sort of mention two of the great enemies of hearing for God, and they are noise and hurry. So I want to start with noise. There's so much noise, and noise isn't necessarily just auditory noise. There's visual noise. There's noise in our brains sometimes, but noise is a difficult thing. Noise distracts us. Noise puts us in a place where we cannot attend to the thing that we're attending to. And so one of the important parts of kind of the disciplines of prayer is cultivating silence, learning to develop silence in our hearts, silence in our minds, silence in our context. Now, the quickest way to begin that is actual silence, where we're not sort of trying to do our prayers, not trying to be in that sort of thoughtful, contemplative place with a lot of literal noise going on. But there are other things that are there are sort of the noise that is going on in our heads. And I think in order to hear God, we have to learn how to be silent, and it is a learning how to be silent. And one of the things I often encourage people to do is to begin with short periods of silence, trying to sort of sit down and say, I'm going to just let silence be here for a minute, where I'm trying not to think of something else. I'm not trying to fill my mind with some idea. There's no noise in the background. I'm just wanting to be silent. Not empty, because I think God fills all things, but a place of silence that I may know the fullness of God in a certain way. And it's easy to start with small things, like do it even for 30 seconds, where we're sitting down and I just want to live in silence for 30 seconds. And if something comes into my mind and distracts me, smile and acknowledge that, but then settle down into silence. That is the beginning place, and it's something that we have to learn. It is not something that's common in our culture, and it's something we have to learn and work at doing. And in that silence, sometimes the Scriptures will speak to us. In that silence, we sometimes see and perceive things, even in our own lives, that are reflective of God and God in our life. But I think the other enemy, of course, beyond silence, is hurry or rush. And we are so rushed, and I find this often when I'm sitting down in my prayers in the morning. I know that I have to get on the road by a certain time to be somewhere, or I have to make sure I do this, and I've got to read all of this text, and I have to make sure I say my morning prayer. And so it is a rushed experience. I'm zipping through prayer, and it's like, how fast can I say the Lord's Prayer and be done with it so I can move on to my next task? Rush is not conducive to silence, but it's not conducive to prayer. And one of the things, even if we're using, for example, the morning prayer service or the evening prayer service, not every element of that needs to be done every time. So if time is an issue and you want to do a little bit less of that, do a little bit less so that you don't have to rush through it. I love Immortal Invisible is a hymn, Immortal Invisible God Only Wise, and there's a line in it that says, God is unresting and unhasting. And there's a sense that he's always active, he's always doing his thing, but he is not in a rush. And if you read sort of the Scriptures and you look at Jesus, Jesus is never in a rush. Rush distracts us from God. Rush distracts us from everybody else as well. So finding ways of limiting things so I do not have to be rushed, because both noise and hurry will interrupt my capacity to hear from God. And then if I can find a place where I'm not rushed, and a place where there is silence, very often, even sometimes the morning prayer service or the evening prayer service or the scriptures come forward to us, and we have a sense of God in the middle of that. And that's largely how we listen in prayer.